Has this topic been addressed before? Yes. But I'm still going to do it because I want to. Some of my friends know that my passion in life is firearms. I am by no means an expert, but I know more than the average person, and I am a gun owner myself. So with this being my nerdy passion, you can probably imagine how I feel about some of the gun designs in TF2. It's no secret to anyone that TF2 is a first-person shooter game. To have an FPS, you need guns. It's a little difficult to shoot someone with a sword, so even though TF2 is in a cartoon art style, it's rooted in reality because it uses a real-world medium. Several, in fact. But the subject of this video is just the firearms because that's kind of the center of attention. The mix of cartoon fiction and real-world logic typically mix like water and oil, as in they don't mix at all. If you have no understanding of how firearms function, it may not have ever dawned on you, but so many of TF2's guns have designs that are questionable at best and physically impossible at worst. So I'm here to use my amateur levels of knowledge and break down everything I know to be wrong with the guns in Team Fortress 2. Now this may or may not have been inspired by a more popular YouTuber doing the same thing with guns from Fallout and Starfield, but you'll never know. Before I begin, I want to say that I'm only going to be focusing on the moderately realistic firearms, because I have real-world examples I can compare to. As far as I know, nobody's made an energy-powered rocket launcher or indivisible particle smasher, so I can't speak to their real-world accuracy. I also want to preface this by saying that there are exceptions to every rule. I'm going to explain things with real-world examples that more or less function universally, but there's always one item out there that goes against the norm. You'll see what I mean later on. One more thing, I want to make it very clear that I'm an amateur, not an expert. I might miss some details or mix some things up, so forgive me of any potential mistakes. Okay, let's go. Firstly, I'm going to address some issues that aren't really weapon specific and are present on most classes, beginning with something you might just roll your eyes out. The TF2 devs universally use the term clip size when discussing the capacity of a particular weapon. Granted, lots of people who aren't all that interested in the technical nature of firearms use this term incorrectly in the exact same fashion. And in their defense, the word clip is relevant with guns, but not in the way it ends up being used. A clip, also known by its full name stripper clip, is usually a small piece of metal that has no moving parts and holds 5 to 10 rounds at the ready to be loaded. Most examples of guns that use clips are bolt-action infantry rifles from the World Wars. The way you use them is you open the bolt, mount the clip to the correct position at the top of the action, press down on the cartridges until they slide into the rifle, and remove the clip. A couple exceptions to this rule would be the M1 Garand with its end-blocked clips, and yes, that is how you say Garand, and the 1907 Roth Steyr, which has a rather complicated stripper clip, but for the most part they all function the same. Multiple unlocks have a reduced clip size stat when what they actually mean in most cases is magazine size. A magazine is an integral part of the firearm that holds rounds at the ready to be cycled into the chamber and fired. Most magazines have a spring and follower to progressively push cartridges into place. A clip is typically used to rapidly load a magazine on certain firearms, and they were commonplace before it was normal to carry multiple detachable magazines. So these terms are not interchangeable, though they are similar, and they both have to deal with loading. But the stat of reduced clip size being replaced for reduced magazine size wouldn't be a universal fix either. If in some alternate universe where we got weapon balances or new weapons again, one of Spy's revolvers might get a smaller clip size stat. Or alternatively, Engineer might get a revolver secondary, which would need that stat to reduce to 6 shots from the pistol's 12. Except these don't have magazines or clips, these are cylinders. Another example of this would be Scout's break-action primaries. Break-action is a form of breech loading, where you open the firearm and place cartridges directly into the chambers. There is no mechanism whatsoever that holds rounds to the side to be loaded into the chamber. No clip, magazine, or cylinder. So assuming TF2 would use one term to cover all examples, the correct way to write it would be reduced capacity, since that term refers to how much a firearm can hold on hand before requiring a reload. One more menu wording error is something that affects shotguns as a whole, but is only prevalent on a couple examples. This is probably what you would call a bullet, except that's a bit of a misnomer. The bullet is the name of the projectile itself and not the entire object. The bullet sits poking out the front of the casing. The correct term for this whole assembly is cartridge, and I'll be referring to them as such. Now with shotguns, they're the same principle but not identical. A typical shotgun cartridge contains a measured amount of lead shot that fires in a scattered pattern rather than as a single projectile. Now, the TF2 developers were informed enough to not use the term bullets when describing cartridges and instead use them for projectiles. Except in this specific case, bullets should be referred to as pellets, since bullets are individual single projectiles that are used to be pinpoint accurate. I know this is nitpicking here, but it's relevant to the topic, so it'd be wrong for me to not bring it up. Now we'll start getting into the guns themselves. I originally intended for these to be in class order, but I didn't want to end on Spy, which, spoiler alert, is kinda boring, you know, with his small number of pistols. So I grouped these together in categories as they relate to one another. And I'm actually going to start with secondaries because the flaws in primary weapons are far more numerous and interesting. First up to the batting box are the pistols, which I guess you could just say are Scout's pistols because Engineer still just has one. Scout's pistols are all semi-automatic, sometimes referred to as autoloaders or self-loading. To showcase the basic idea, here's my Beretta Model 9000S. I know it's not the exact same model of handgun that the TF2 pistol was based on, but it'll show what I want to. A typical auto-loading pistol works like this. As a round is fired, energy from the shot is used to reciprocate the slide. The slide moves to the rear and then is pushed forward again by a spring, and the energy moving forward is used to pick up a cartridge from the magazine and load it into the chamber, where it is then ready to fire again by simply pulling the trigger a second time. No manual action is needed between shots, thus it is considered semi-automatic. When the pistol is empty, reloading requires pressing the magazine release, placing a loaded magazine inside the grip of the pistol, and either releasing or racking the slide. Now you might just jump and think it's fully automatic because in TF2 holding down the fire button is effectively one trigger pull, thus making it a machine gun. Well, I wouldn't lean on that because weapons that are clearly not full auto have the same function, so that's not really relevant. So where do problems begin to show themselves? Firstly, we can observe an external hammer so we know it's hammer fired, and neither hammer or slide move at all, they're completely static. For a semi-automatic pistol to function at all, the slide has to reciprocate in order to actually load the chamber. Also, when reloading, you seem to just insert a new magazine. You can see it drop in Scout's first-person animation, but for the rest of them, there's no visible indication that the empty magazine left the grip, nor is the weapon charged once reloaded. There's also no magazine release button anywhere on the pistol. So that, plus the disappearing empty magazine, leads me to think that the only logical explanation is that the pistol shoots the entire magazine by just sucking it up through the solid barrel and out the muzzle. It's like a step up from Aperture Science sentry turrets, which fire the entire cartridge.
We fire the whole bullet. That's 65% more bullet per bullet.
Manco fires the cartridge and magazine. And this nonsense applies to all three of the pistols. The Winger has no visible hammer at all, but we can give that a pass by considering it a striker-fired handgun. Now, a hammer-fired pistol uses an external hammer to impact the firing pin, which hits the primer and by extension fires the shot. A striker-fired pistol uses the pulling of the trigger to more or less directly pull the firing pin back and then releases it to hit the primer. A real-world example of this would be any of the Glock pistols. Perhaps it never crossed your mind why you don't see a hammer on those, and now you know. But being striker-fired does not justify the immobile slide. All the pistols are solid models with no moving parts, which makes them impossible to function in the real world. The flare guns are weird because they almost got it right, but missed the mark just barely. A survival flare pistol is a one-shot, breech-loading, single-action pistol. This design is ideal for flare guns because something like this is almost as mechanically simple as firearms get. Single action means that the user must cock the hammer before it can fire. This is my Model 1848 Dragoon, and I understand that's a bit of a wild example, but it will give a visual. With the hammer down, I can pull that trigger all day and it's not going to do anything. I have to manually cock the hammer back for it to function. Since this design is 176 years old, it predates double action by just a couple years. But the important thing to note is that single action is simpler and less prone to failure. Therefore, on something like a survival flare pistol, it's desirable. The last thing you want is your survival pistol to malfunction. And both the modeler and animator for the flare guns clearly knew this because the hammer does move, and in the reload animation, Pyro cocks the hammer with his thumb. Except there's a very small mistake that you might miss if you don't look closely. The hammer functions opposite of what it's supposed to. When cocked, the hammer is in the forward position, when fired it moves rearward, and when Pyro moves his thumb towards the rear to cock it, the hammer moves forward again. Perhaps the motions of the hammer were given negative values or something? I don't know enough about animation to diagnose the issue. All I know is they had the right idea and they missed the mark by inches. This problem is identical for the detonator as well. I'd assume because of the recycling of animations, there's no reason it would be right on one and wrong on the other. Except no, because the Scorch Shot doesn't have this problem. The hammer moves in the direction it's supposed to. Although I say hammer, there's no gap in the rear of this model, so the hammer is not striking anything. One could argue it's just a cocking lever for a different mechanism inside, but who knows. Regardless, there is one issue that none of the flare guns escaped. Much like on the pistols, you kind of have to actuate a button or a lever in order for the thing to break open and reload. But the pyro seems to just open it with telekinesis or something because it just falls open without input. There's also no shell ejection, but caseless grenades do exist, so perhaps Manco has some sort of caseless flare for pyro? Unlikely, but it's possible. Overall, the flare guns got super close, and missing those tiny little details I think we can forgive, especially in the face of some later examples. The submachine guns are another case of being so unbelievably close the designers probably don't even realize. A submachine gun is a fully automatic pistol caliber firearm, usually with a sub 16-inch barrel. The designs of them vary, but what's most common in the era of TF2 is an open bolt design. Open bolt guns exist because of their simplicity, which makes them good for mass production in wartime emergencies. Famous examples being the M3 grease gun, the Sten, the MP40, and the PPSH-41. And no, I don't have an example of a submachine gun to show you, that would be an NFA item. An open bolt, as the name implies, fires with the bolt in the rearward position. They work by using momentum of the bolt slamming forward to feed a cartridge into the chamber and fire it. Then from the blowback of the cartridge is pushed rearward again and is ready to fire again. I say all this because snipers' SMGs would be more or less right on the money if the bolt worked inversely of how it does. To me at least, the super simple design of the chassis leads me to really doubt that this would work by a closed bolt, since those are considerably more complicated than open bolt. Contextually and historically, this would be odd, and it gets a little worse when you consider it has the same problem as the pistols where the weapon is not charged during a reload. That's probably the best one yet. Where the weapon is not charged during a reload. All Sniper does is change magazines. Now this wouldn't be impossible, but it would absolutely be unreasonable. You see, it's a real technique in gunfighting to count your shots and to know when you're down to just one round left. With this knowledge, you can change the magazines and not have to operate the charging handle or slide. In semi-automatic applications, this is doable, but with rapid-fire, fully automatic firearms, you have to be Superman to keep track of how much you have loaded. One more issue with the SMG is no magazine release. I think I'm noticing a trend here. Overall, I'd put the SMGs on a similar level as the flare guns. They almost got it, but a few small details were lacking. But I can give credit to the charging handle moving like it's supposed to, unlike the pistols. Now's the time we get to look at the primary weapons. And yes, I know I missed the sticky launchers, I'm counting those as primaries for this topic. I'm gonna go in order from what I consider least interesting upwards. Medic is a boring one and it shouldn't take much explanation. First of all, the syringe guns don't even count as firearms because under the definition of the NFA, or the National Firearms Act of 1934, a firearm is a weapon that propels a projectile via an explosive. Compressed air is not an explosive. But I'm going to cover them anyway. The biggest problem is the very obvious one: none of the syringe guns actually reload. All you do is replace the tiny compressed air cartridge on the back of the model. So apparently Medic's super genius has developed syringe guns that regenerate their own ammunition. Also, there's something that's not really mentioned much. There is no chance in hell that this tiny pneumatic cartridge in the back has enough compression to push out 40 needles with lethal force. It would make more sense to me if there was an air hose connected between the syringe gun and the Medic's backpack, especially since at the bottom of the grip you can pretty clearly see what looks to be a pneumatic quick connector. Man, it's a weirdly common trend for the modelers and animators to not be on the same page. The revolvers have a similar issues to the pistols mentioned before. There's not enough moving parts. The cylinders don't rotate, nor do the hammers move while firing. And when reloading, the ejector rod is not used. Since revolvers don't auto-eject casings like semi-automatic pistols do, when reloading you need to push the ejector rod to the rear and allow the casings to fall out before loading in more. I can't show you this one either because my Dragoon is a muzzle-loading revolver. But if you've ever played Half-Life 2, look at the way that the Magnum is reloaded. That'll give you an idea. This once again seems like an Aperture Science method of firing the entire damn cartridge somehow.
Fire the whole bullet.
Another thing that makes no sense, the size of the barrel at the muzzle is considerably larger than the size of the cartridges in the cylinder. And this is a problem for all but one, that one being the Stranger. The worst of the bunch is the Enforcer. The bore looks like it's twice the diameter of the projectile as it fires. For a barrel to actually send a bullet in a straight line, it needs to at the very least have a tight fit around the projectile. This is also improved with rifling, which are spiral grooves inside the barrel that create a gyroscope and improve accuracy even further. But your rifling does nothing if your barrel doesn't even touch the projectile. Even without rifling in the equation, a barrel needs to be tight to the projectile and create a gas seal to actually propel the thing. So the bullets would immediately begin to lose speed once they left the casing, and you might as well have no barrel at all. It's also necessary to point out that all of the revolvers use the same speed loader animation in the reload, but only stock and the Enforcer have a model for the speed loader. Spy just pushes his thumb against the cylinder for the rest. Once again, a trend for handguns to have next to no moving pieces. The flamethrowers are kind of odd. As a basic principle, a flamethrower is very simple. You use a flammable substance under pressure and launch it towards your target. As it leaves the weapon, it's ignited by a pilot light. And yeah, on paper, that's pretty much exactly what the flamethrowers do. The thing is, flamethrowers in real life use liquids like napalm. They shoot a long, linear stream that has a considerable range, compared to Pyro's flamethrowers, which are more of a gaseous cloud that has very little range. I guess this is sorta logical because on the stock flamethrower, the fuel tank is very clearly supposed to be a propane tank. Hank Hill would be proud. The degreaser is similar, being modeled after a different compressed gas cylinder. Even the concept of the phlogistinator comes from the old theory of phlogiston being the element that was the source of fire, and phlogiston turned out to be oxygen. At least that's how I've been told the story. The point is, oxygen is a highly flammable gas, so it fits the theme. So for your regular plus attack, while a bit unorthodox, it's not impossible or unrealistic. Air blast, on the other hand, that's a completely different story, but I don't think I have to give a physics lesson for you to understand that compressed air in a handheld form would be nowhere near powerful enough to completely reverse directions of projectiles and launch fully grown men into the air. I have faith that you understand that well enough. Now things are going to start getting much dumber and more interesting. The rocket launchers all more or less share the same big issue of defying physics. And I'm not talking about the behaviors of the rocket itself. While a rocket traveling at comically slow speed is wrong, and said rocket not instantly killing everything in the blast radius is also wrong, we can let those slide because of game balance. And this video isn't supposed to be about ballistics anyway, we're focusing on the weapons themselves. What I'm talking about is the impossibility of holding multiple rockets inside one tube. Every soldier primary has this problem. The default is 4, they have a minimum of 3, and can go up to 8. Stacking 4 rockets on top of each other inside the same tube would at bare minimum create different results for each rocket fired, since it would have less or more barrel than the previous one. And what's even more likely, the blast from the thruster would be powerful enough to detonate the explosive charge and all the rockets behind it, so it would just explode and kill the soldier holding it. Now, the concept of a gun having projectiles stacked in the same barrel is not impossible and actually does exist in the real world. There is something from the days following the American Revolution called the Chambers machine gun, which is a very interesting piece, and I recommend you watch the Forgotten Weapons video of it to get an in-depth explanation. But that uses an entirely different system with black powder and flintlocks that wouldn't be possible with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, especially since the rockets are shaped how they are. To the designer's credit, the rocket launcher would probably work fine in the real world if it only held 1 rocket at a time. But 4, 8 even? Yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. Also, not to mention the sights for most of these wouldn't really work. Some of them have no sights at all, but specifically Stock and Liberty Launcher have a pretty obvious front sight. The Liberty Launcher even looks to have multiple front posts for different elevations, which is a nice little detail. The only problem is, with iron sights, you kinda need a rear sight for them to do you any good. You're supposed to line up the front post inside the rear notch or aperture in order for actual precision. Granted, at the close ranges of most TF2 fights, this would be completely unnecessary. But rocket launchers in the real world are meant for an absolute minimum of about 300 meters for moving targets. At least that's what the internet tells me. Explosives are potent, you don't want them going off close to your own men, so long-range precision is absolutely necessary. The direct hit is probably closest to reality with its faster projectile in the scope, though you can't use it in-game. And then there's the rest of the launchers, which have no sights to speak of. The airstrike sorta looks like it has a front, but the shape and position of it is so wrong I almost don't count it. And I should say, while very strange, the Beggar's Bazooka would probably work if set up correctly. It's made up of cast iron flanged pipe couplings, which are extremely thick, and would probably be able to withstand the pressure, with 1 rocket and not 3. Demoman's weapons have mostly repeat trends from previous mentions, so I should get those out of the way pretty quickly. Stock grenade launcher is mostly correct. It has a couple minor problems and the one slightly larger problem. The front sight is absolutely enormous and there is once again no rear sight. The cylinder clearly has a visual capacity for 6, but you can only load 4. Though we can blame that on Demoman being shit and forgetting to load 6. Now, tertiary, both in the inspect animation and in the class selection menu, Demo spins the cylinder freely with his left hand. And this would not really be possible with how firearms that use cylinders function. Here's my Dragoon again. No, it's not a grenade launcher, I'm aware of that. With a hammer down, the cylinder is not going to budge, nor will it when I fully cock the hammer. For cylinders to rotate freely, I need to set the hammer to half cock. Stop snickering, I can hear you giggling at me saying the word cock. Please pause the video and get back to me when you've matured beyond a 5th grade intellect. Okay, you ready to continue? The reason for this feature is safety. If the cylinder was unlocked or loose before or after the hammer strikes, the chamber and barrel could misalign, and when that happens, the projectile slams into the sidewall of the barrel and the gun explodes in your hand. Demoman's grenade launcher isn't single action since there's no visible hammer on the exterior, but the principle is still the same. If it were to be out of alignment, then the results would most likely be fatal. For the cylinder to spin freely, in this case, the action would probably have to be open. One more small detail, in a double action revolver, the pulling of the trigger does things in this order. The cylinder rotates into place and the hammer rises. The cylinder locks, and only when the trigger is completely pulled does the hammer drop. The grenade launcher has this in reverse order, where the cylinder spins after the shot is fired rather than before. However, I'm not 100% sure how accurate this is to real grenade launchers, so maybe. It's certainly not impossible for it to have a different mechanism. All in all, the stock grenade launcher is pretty good. At least the cylinder actually moves, unlike someone we know. As far as the unlocks go, all that's there to talk about is the lock and load and loose cannon having the same problem as the rocket launchers, where you're stuffing in more ammunition than the thing would physically hold. Lock and load would hold 2 and loose cannon would hold 1. That's it, really. Heavy's got miniguns. Kinda. The name minigun is specifically tied to the American M134, which is a rotary machine gun. And a rotary machine gun is a large caliber, multiple barreled, fully automatic firearm that uses a Gatling type rotating barrel assembly to deliver a sustained saturational direct fire at much greater rates of fire than a single barreled autocannon of the same caliber. And that's quoted from Wikipedia. So if we're splitting hairs on technicality, Heavy only has 3 miniguns. Meanwhile, the Tomislav and Hualong Heater are simply heavy machine guns. I should also mention that miniguns are not intended for infantry use, since the guns themselves weigh a ton, and to carry enough ammunition to make it useful would make it weigh even more. But that can be excused away by Heavy being an absolute fucking unit, and all of that is small potatoes anyway. I care more about the functionalities of the weapon itself. And in that regard, I only found 2 discrepancies. One is universal for most FPS games. Miniguns in real life don't need time to spin up. They're powered by electric motors that get them moving pretty much immediately. Besides that, the barrel spinning slowly doesn't prevent the firing mechanisms from functioning, so even if there was a slow spin up, it would begin firing immediately. Although we can forgive this one too because it's done in the name of game balance. Also, one could argue that the spin time is mostly Heavy lowering the muzzle to aim downrange, so that's also relevant. Overall, not a huge break in reality. But there is one more thing, and I'll see if you can put the pieces together yourself. Miniguns are machine guns. A machine gun is defined under the NFA as any weapon which shoots, is designed to shoot, or can readily be restored to shoot automatically more than one shot without manual reloading by a single function of the trigger, with some other minor defining jargon in there afterwards. So, TLDR, a machine gun is a firearm that shoots multiple times with one pull of the trigger. One pull of the trigger. Yeah, the trigger. This one caught me off guard too. The only heavy primary that has a trigger is the Tomislav. The rest of them are apparently fired through sheer Soviet willpower. I mean, in first person, you don't even look at your firing hand, so I guess it's not all that important, but more than anything, it's hilarious. A weapon among the few in TF2 that are defined by the NFA as machine guns are missing a key factor in the definition of machine guns, and that's just ironic. Bolt-action rifles are among the simplest repeating firearms in the world. Most of the moving parts are totally manual. They're so simple it's hard to screw them up, but Valve managed to, so here we go. The obvious and uninteresting first problem is the impossibly large capacity. Most of the rifles are completely flush along the bottom of the receiver. This fact in itself is consistent with most bolt actions, since both sniping rifles and infantry bolt actions typically had flush magazines along the bottom. But those guns usually have a maximum capacity of 10, typically 5, and sometimes as low as 3 when you get into hunting rifles. Notice how none of those numbers were even close to 25. The Classic might be able to fit 25 depending on the size of the cartridge, but that would be a stretch. Stock rifle looks like it would be a single shot with no magazine at all, especially considering the size of the bore on this thing. I understand this is probably an art style thing. The reasoning was likely so that you could see the muzzle from a distance. But this looks like a shotgun barrel for how wide it is. A typical sniper rifle is usually 30 caliber or roughly 3/10 of an inch in diameter. I know this is only eyeball estimates, but come on, there's no way that this is only 3/10 of an inch. The next step up in category would be anti-material, which goes up into absurdly large sizes like 20mm. However, anti-material cartridges are extremely high in pressure and require a considerably larger rifle in order to handle it. So in other words, not something like this. But none of that is as bad as the issue with the bolts themselves, the very thing that defines these rifles as bolt action. This is yet another case where there had to be separate teams working on the third Third person? Third firstin. Wow, okay. I'm getting tired. This is another case where they had to be separate teams working on the third and first person animations. To cycle a typical bolt action, you twist the bolt handle up to unlock, pull the bolt rearwards to eject the empty casing, push forward to chamber the next round, and then push down to lock the bolt in place. And both of the animations got different halves to that sequence. In first person, you just turn the bolt and don't slide it, but in third person, you slide the bolt and don't turn it. Like, was there no coordination between the people who made these? What's the deal with this? And the problem is made worse with the Machina and the Classic, because neither of these have bolt handles at all. The Classic is based on a real-world semi-automatic rifle, which is not a sniper rifle, but could be converted to a DMR setup. But the presence of the recycled bolt animation implies that this rifle is no longer in semi-automatic. Even throwing all that to the side, there's no charging handle that could be operated even if it were semi-auto. And the Machina is based on a semi-auto rifle from a different game, so it fails in the exact same fashion. That's such a goofy oversight to remove the very thing which defines a weapon's functionality. The sticky launchers have two dumb features that shouldn't take long. Firstly, the repeat trend of a bottomless magazine. Despite the charging handle reciprocating while shooting, which implies it's a semi-auto, all you do to reload is cycle it again. What should be happening is you're either replacing the magazine, which would break game balance, or you load one at a time through some other means, likely the ejection port. If we were to take this animation literally, Demoman would be repeatedly loading and ejecting bombs into and out of the chamber. The other questionable logic is the chosen method for the sticking application. Demoman can launch these bombs, which lackadaisically arc and don't move very fast, onto pretty much any surface made with any material, and you're telling me these tiny little spikes are enough to make them stay in place? I question the logic behind that. The idea that penetrating concrete and diamond plate steel with itty-bitty spikes on a large round ball is optimistic to say the least. I don't think a sticky bomb launcher is a real-world weapon, but the most realistic alternative thing I would be able to think of is some sort of C4-ish projectile, since C4 is like a putty that is soft and sticky. But nah, I mean, I guess it's an art style thing again, but it's dumb. Next up are the shotguns, which means multiclass plus engineers, primaries plus the family business. The list of multiclass shotguns is the longest, but Scout has the most offensive design choices with his guns, so I wanted to end on those. Most of the shotguns have universal problems that all stem from recycled attributes. Most obviously is the left-hand configuration of the right-hand view models. In case you've never fired a gun before, freshly fired casings are hot. There's a literal explosion inside of them and a lot of heat is generated. So when ejecting empty casings, you want them flying away from the user and not towards them. Now, shotgun hulls aren't all that hot because they're usually plastic, and shotguns are relatively low pressure compared to rifle rounds, so not as much heat is created. But even knowing that, it's still unideal to throw hot powder residue anywhere near the user of a firearm. This is probably another art style decision because of the port being on the side where the player is looking fills what would be a blank space on the side of the receiver. It's also noteworthy to point out that not every human on Earth is right-handed, and thus there exist wrong-hand configurations for most type of firearms, shotguns included. We'll ignore the fact that left-hand viewed models just flip the image and we get the same problem because it's another recycled attribute. What we can do is explain the large number of lefty shotguns by blaming Manco for its incompetence. It seems totally reasonable for that company to make a logistical error and manufacture a bunch of shotguns that are ass backwards. The next problem that is present on all the shotguns is a lack of a partial reload. And that's mostly to do with TF2 programming as a whole because nothing gets a partial reload. But for shotguns it's especially relevant because people unnecessarily cock the shotgun once they've loaded all 6 shots inside. And all the classes do it. Pyro specifically goes a step further because he cycles the thing every time he pulls it out. To the animator's credit, this does have some purpose in the real world. Because most long guns are not drop safe, if you're carrying one and not actively using it, then it's safer to keep it clear until you make contact with the enemy. However, this isn't really the case because Pyro doesn't clear the shotgun once he puts it away. You've probably done this in-game at least once before. And no, shotguns are not like super soakers. They don't get more powerful the more you pump the handle. Realistically speaking, Pyro shotguns would always have less than the max capacity. But anyway, those are the problems that just affect all of the shotguns. Ultimately, the base for them isn't all that bad, and these issues can be forgiven, especially considering how old the game is. This is actually one part of why I love the stock shotgun. It's almost as close to real as the TF2 guns get, but the unlocks have their own individual quirks that make less sense. The Rescue Ranger and Frontier Justice in themselves aren't all that bad. I'm looking past the gameplay mechanics because if we're taking crits into account, then none of the TF2 items would qualify in the real world. As a basic concept, the Frontier Justice would work like a regular shotgun, and it's not even that weird for the longer shotgun with a larger magazine tube to have lower capacity. In most US states, when bird hunting, you are legally limited to a shotgun capacity of 3, and full-length shotguns can be equipped with magazine plugs that physically limit the amount of ammunition you can fit inside. The mechanical stuff on the side wouldn't do anything, but that's got nothing to do with the function of the weapon itself. Now for the Rescue Ranger, ignore the repair mechanics, that's a gameplay function. The concept of a shotgun being set up to fire rifle projectiles that function sort of like a broadhead arrow tip would be strange, but not at all impossible. It wouldn't serve any purpose in the real world other than I guess some sort of hollow point, but it would function. The Widowmaker is another promotional item from a sci-fi game, and in itself wouldn't really be practical. It's huge and rectangular, very likely heavy, and the stock where you'd rest your cheek would be very uncomfortable. But functionally, I can't see this having many issues. It's got a charging handle on the side, and since it's a semi-auto, this is necessary. Unfortunately for us, the handle doesn't cycle while firing, but that's not necessarily unrealistic. There's plenty of semi-auto weapons out there which don't have reciprocating charging handles. Annoyingly though, because of more recycled attributes, the third-person animation pumps the grip in the front. We almost had it. The only other thing I'm unsure of is this mystery toggle switch on the side. I have no idea what that might do. My first thought was a bolt release, which is possible, but the presence of a charging handle makes that kind of unnecessary. It might also be a safety, or possibly a selector switch even. There's no way to tell really. But all in all, Widowmaker's not too bad. The reserve shooter is pretty heavily based on the stock shotgun, so it's mostly covered by the same stuff, except for this. What the hell is this thing on top of the receiver? It's way too tall to be a rear sight for any small arm, let alone a shotgun, which usually doesn't need any sights at all. But aside from this stupid chode on the top, there's nothing else to talk about here. Rounding off multiclass, we get to the panic attack. Man, this thing had potential. The model is based on one of the best looking shotguns ever, the Winchester M1897 trench gun. The heat shield over the barrel and the exposed hammer would have made a wonderful model if they weren't cancelled out by this stupid drum magazine on the front. First of all, out on the front end is the worst possible place to put a big, heavy, awkwardly shaped drum on any type of firearm. Because of this little thing called physics, you don't want extra weight out where it gets the most leverage possible. Isaac Newton, you whore. Second of all, a drum magazine's only upside is high capacity. They're huge, hard to carry, and like I said before, they weigh a lot. So if you're using a drum at all, you would want some higher capacity, right? Well, you get the same exact amount as stock. So much for all that extra volume you don't need. And the cherry on top of all of this is this wouldn't even function because of how a shotgun feeds. So this big stupid thing does literally everything wrong it could possibly do wrong. Why is it even here? And finally we reach the family business, which interestingly enough is one of only 2 shotguns in right-hand configuration. Functionally, this one is pretty sound, but there's a weird quirk to this one. The rear grip is having trouble figuring out its identity because it's crossed between a pistol grip and a traditional grip. For it to be traditional, it would be built into the straight line stock. For it to be a pistol grip, it would need to come more or less straight down, like this. The angle that this is at would make shooting very uncomfortable since each shot would wedge your thumb webbing into this little corner. I guess if you're heavy though, that probably wouldn't bother you. Finally, we're rounding off the list with the scatterguns. By definition, a shotgun and scattergun are the same thing, but in this context, they're not, so we're gonna keep them separate. Normally I'd begin with stock, but that's actually one of the worst offenders, so I'm beginning with his break-action guns. The force of nature is pretty close to perfect. Although, to be fair, a break-action shotgun is probably the simplest cartridge-firing firearm in the world, and you'd have to be someone like Bethesda to mess that one up. The only moving parts are the trigger and the brake lever, which both function. A typical side-by-side usually has 2 triggers for the separate barrels, but single trigger models do exist, so that's not a factor. The only thing I can knock the force of nature for is ergonomics. The front grip is rectangular and wouldn't be all that comfortable to hold, and the barrels are so short that you would probably have almost no velocity coming out the end. But functionally it would work, so I gotta give it a pass. The soda popper is pretty much the same, though with all the cracks and patches, I don't think I would trust this one. I don't want to put my face on something that might explode. By the way, I want to mention something unrelated. I have heard the soda popper referred to as a broken and repaired force of nature, but if you look at them side by side, you can tell that's not true. Alright, continuing. Moving on, we have the shortstop, which has one problem. It's based on a concealed carry quad barrel break action pistol called the COP 357. That gun functions by a rotating mechanism which actuates 4 separate firing pins. So tell me, why is there a hammer? If this thing has 4 separate strikers for each chamber, then it cannot physically be hammer fired. Post-production indie here, I went back and looked at how the COP 357 works, and it turns out I was mistaken. It actually does have an internal hammer with a rotating striker system which hits one firing pin at a time. The hammer looks and functions nothing like the one on the model would, so I still see this as an error, but I wanted to correct my mistake. That is, unless this is somehow the brake lever and not a hammer at all, which would be weird, but possible. And now it's finally time to address the lever action scatterguns, and I use that term loosely because it barely counts. The stock scattergun has some design flaws in the model itself. It has iron sights that you couldn't use if you wanted to because the magazine completely blocks your view of the rear notch. You'd be forgiven if you never noticed the rear notch until today because it makes zero sense why it would be put there. But the rear sight would be stupid even if you could see it because it's a rifle sight. This NFA qualified felony charge short-barreled shotgun has rifle sights. As I mentioned earlier, most shotguns intended to shoot shot patterns which either have no sight at all or just a small front bead. Since you aren't trying to be pinpoint accurate, anything more than that is unnecessary. If a shotgun is set up to shoot slugs instead, then better sights become useful, but that's not relevant when your barrel is so short that using it for slugs would be a fool's errand. And now's the time we address the reload. Remember our friend the sticky launcher? And the syringe gun? And the sniper rifle? Same idea, the magazine is bottomless. And while firing cycles itself, which implies semi-automatic. Except to reload, you don't reload, you simply cycle the action on repeat. To add insult to this goofy-ass design, on the bottom of the magazine, plain as day, is a loading gate. Very clearly there was intention for shells to be loaded in from the bottom, but the animator said to hell with it. I don't understand why was there so much lack of communication here. The babyface's blaster is victim to the same dumb animation, but otherwise it's okay. It's modeled to look like a modified Browning Auto 5 with a tiny drum underneath. I'm not sure why they went with a drum because that magazine tube looks full length and probably would have held 4 shots all the same. The only logic to adding this drum after the fact would be quick change magazines, but that's not the case either. The sights are better, the front post is moderate, and there's no rear notch. The issue here is a lack of loading gate. This could be worked around by either allowing the magazine to detach or by loading shells through the ejection port. It'd be odd, but functional. I mean, lots of old bolt actions do that. Remember our friend Stripper Clip? Lastly, we meet the worst of the bunch. The backscatter combines the problems of several other examples thus far, starting with the wasted drum magazine, much like the panic attack. All you comedy geniuses out there with the 5th grade intellect that I mentioned before are out there laughing at this phallic shape, and just so you know, the balls are empty. It's got a lower capacity than stock despite this gigantic MG15 magazine on the top. It's also got the same reload problem as the rest of the lever guns. The sights are somehow even worse since they're cartoonishly oversized like the grenade launcher on top of having the pointless rear notch. And the cherry on top of all of that is there's no loading gate or ejection port, so even if you wanted to fix this gun by giving it a new animation, you couldn't because there's no hole for the shells to go in or out except the muzzle. The model is even dumber than its gameplay design. I hate to beat this weapon while it's down, but it's actually got nothing going for it. Man, when I picked this topic I was not expecting the writing to take this long, but here we are. The finished script for this video was 7,780 words long, and I'm sure once I get through post-production this will end up being my longest video I've uploaded. And actually looking at Audacity right now, I just crossed over 1 hour of recording. Sometimes it's really hard to sit down and grind out something of this scale, but I'm riding on the coattails of a very successful video which I would have never expected to take off. Now that there's an extra couple hundred of you out there, I feel like I owe it to you to get this done in a timely manner. One last thing before I go, I wanted to give you all an opportunity. I hate promoting my own stuff, but you may want to know about this one. I used to do organized deathmatch games in the evenings through my Discord server. It's been a while since I've done any, but I would like to do some more. I occasionally take the silly moments from those events and put them into videos, so if you want to get involved, you can join by the link provided. Okay, that's enough promotion. A genuine thank you for sitting this long and tolerating my annoying nerdy side. This is just something I wanted to make for a while, and I figured now was time to do it. Thanks for watching, remember to lock your doors, and have a good evening.